Hey, Saints, and I hope you are doing well. I want to thank you for continuing this Bible journey with us, whether you've been reading along every day and have kept up, whether you've read a little and have gotten behind, whether you haven't read at all but occasionally like watching these videos. But either way, I believe that the more time we spend with the Bible, the more we learn, and the more, most importantly, we learn of God's purposes for us. And so here's a summary for the reading that we did in the month of May. In the month of May, we had quite the expansive bit of Bible reading from First Chronicles chapter 3 all the way through the Book of Esther. So I'll give a summary of what happened and we'll see what's up. And so in First Chronicles, we zoom in on chapter 3 and we start off hearing the names of many of the descendants. As I mentioned, this can seem kind of boring. However, if you pay attention to names that are similar and if you pay attention to discrepancies in genealogies, I think it can be kind of fun. It picks up around chapter 9, where we hear once again about Saul becoming king. We hear about how his kingship and that of his family went downhill in chapter 10. And then King David takes over in chapter 11. And we hear a lot about David's exploits in this second telling of the story. One thing I believe, and you can disagree with me, is that the Chronicles version of this telling is more pro-David than the original tellings in the books of Samuel and Kings. Case in point, in chapter 21, we have this story once again of a census that David called for that ended up resulting in God being really mad and there being a plague against the people. And so in the original version of this story, it was God who incited David against the people. But in this version of the story, it is Satan who incited David against the people. And so it reflects better upon God for sure, and also upon David. We move forward to chapter 28 and we get the transition to Solomon. And one thing that's different is that in the original telling of the story, the transition from David to Solomon had a lot of drama. You know, we had several of David's sons attempting to assume kingship, and David was sort of out of it before this transition ever happened. Whereas in this version of the story, David was in right mind and he did a lot to help smooth this transition, and he did a lot to set up Solomon. So there we have it. Then we move on to Second Chronicles. We begin with Solomon's prayer for wisdom, Solomon building the temple, Solomon's exploits. Solomon seems like a really awesome king here. Another thing that makes us seem pro-Davidic line is that in this version of the telling, we don't hear a lot about Solomon's errors or his sins. In chapter 10, we have the revolt against Rehoboam, and Rehoboam goes on to become the king just of Judah and Benjamin and some of the Levites, and that's a story that is the same elsewhere. One thing that we learn about Rehoboam this time around is that Rehoboam was actually a pretty darn good administrator. He may not have been the best leader of the people. He certainly didn't lead them to stay true to the faith, but he was pretty solid in terms of the administration of being a king. We continue to hear about the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel. The kings of Judah seem to come out better this telling. Chapter 29, we meet Hezekiah, one of the really awesome kings of Judah, one of the last ones, but one of the really good ones. And in chapter 26, we finish off as we hear the people going off to exile. And at the end of it, we hear that they came back under Cyrus. And so those are the books of First and Second Chronicles. Next up, we read the Book of Ezra. Now, the Book of Ezra begins at the end of the exile. People return to build the temple. And so there's resistance to this because there were people who were there and they didn't want the temple built. And so we heard about this, and we hear about how they bribed local officials. They sent a letter of accusation against the people of Israel to King Artaxerxes, and they find different ways to slow them down. Finally, it's weird because the book is called Ezra, but Ezra himself actually only shows up in chapter 7. He shows up and he's a big deal. He's a descendant of Phinehas, who's the son of Eleazar, son of Aaron, so really of the high priestly line. And we hear about how he went up from Babylon to offer some critical leadership to the people. Towards the end of the book of Ezra, we hear about the denunciation of mixed marriages, and we hear about how foreign wives and their children are rejected. And this is a troubling trend that we see in this book of Ezra, and later on we'll see it in Ezra and Nehemiah as well, about issues around people mixing with other people, issues around ethnicity, and even examples of ethnic cleansing. And so it has sort of a troubling end here. We move on to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, a great leader of his people, is sent back to help restore more. And so whereas around Ezra's time they rebuilt the temple, around Nehemiah they rebuilt more of the city and the wall. He sees to the restorations of things. Once again, there are plots to foil the restoration of things and to oppress the people And he works against that. He works with Ezra to reestablish the law, including Sabbath reform, with an interesting story about he was so mad when people were breaking the Sabbath that he said if he finds them out and about on the Sabbath that he will lay his hands on them. And he meant so not figuratively, but literally, which is kind of hilarious. And then finally, towards the end of the book of Nehemiah, we have some more examples of concerns about the people of Israel mixing with those who are there, and other examples of ethnic cleansing. And then finally, we finished off with the Book of Esther, which is fabulous, which is absolutely awesome. In the Book of Esther, we hear at first about Queen Vashti. And Queen Vashti was the queen of all the people, but her king was an idiot and decided that he wanted to show her off, and she decided that she wasn't about that life, and so she said, I'm not coming. So then he decides, okay, I need to choose a new king, and a queen rather, and eventually Esther, who's a Jew, though unknown to him, is chosen. Now Esther was raised by her cousin Mordecai, her older cousin Mordecai, and Mordecai comes to play because he ends up saving the king from a plot against his life, and so that's good for Mordecai. However, Haman, who's the king's sort of second-hand person, decides that he wants to get rid of Mordecai and all the Jews because they don't pay homage to him. And so much of this book is about this plot that Haman has to exterminate all the Jews, eventually leading to a proclamation that all Jews must be exterminated. Esther, using her power and position as queen, appeals to the king. As a result of her appeal to the king and her working with Mordecai, who guided her throughout the way, Haman eventually gets what he deserves. He is killed. Mordecai is elevated into his position, and the Jews are given freedom to fight for their freedom and for their lives, and they do so. And so over the last several chapters, it shows how the Jews, now free to defend themselves, defended themselves quite well, and made a home for themselves there. Towards the end of this, we hear about commemoration of this through a new feast called Purim. And so anyway, so these chapters have been quite awesome. This month of reading has been quite momentous. We go from the monarchy to exile to back, including some folks who stayed in exile. And so I hope you enjoyed this month of reading. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that this will encourage you to keep on keeping on through the month of May. Anyways, I will see you all soon.